Hello, friends, fans, and even those who wish to tie me up pinata style and beat me with a stick. I'm glad you're here. I'm CJ Werleman, and this is episode number 13 of Foreign Object. I honestly believe this show wouldn't even make it past episode number 2, but the guests continue to be more and more interesting, and just maybe today's guest is the most interesting of them all. So let's get started. The Bush-Cheney torture program ranks among the darkest chapters in US history. A civilization's progress can often be judged by how it treats its animals and its prisoners. For instance, in China, people are locked up without a fair trial, tend to a cage, while being fed a bowl of soup made out of puppies. We are not China, damn it, but unfortunately the US behaved like the worst of the worst human rights violators during the early years of the ongoing war on terror. Last month, the US Senate released its investigation into the CIA torture program. The findings were every bit as depraved as the most depraved could have imagined, including waterboarding, rape, murder, and rectal feeding. How outraged were Americans upon learning of the unjustifiable violence carried out in its name? Almost not at all. The torture report was a trending topic on Twitter for a little more than 24 hours, while ending as a subject on cable news not much longer after that. In fact, more Americans were outraged by NFL star Michael Vick torturing dogs than there were Bush Cheney torturing humans. My guest has experienced firsthand the horrors of this dark chapter. Moazzam Begg was arrested in Pakistan and imprisoned without trial. He was then tortured at the US prison facility in Bagram before being held in Guantanamo Bay. And he's with me now to talk about his horrific experience. Moazzam, welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Mate, yeah, thanks. As I said to you off the air, I've been trying to get you on this program for the last several weeks, so I'm very thankful that you're here, and I really look forward to this discussion. Now, mate, your story is riveting, and you tell it so well in your book, Enemy Combatant. And I guess to get the conversation started, I want to go back to, I guess, the days leading up to 9/11. Where were you on that day?
Yeah, of course. Well, I had moved to live in Afghanistan with my wife and children in the summer of 2001. We began a project from the United Kingdom, which was to build schools, especially for girls in the Taliban-administered regions, which people didn't understand the Taliban had allowed. We were also building wells in the northwest regions of Afghanistan.
Okay, and you I think in your book or maybe your interview, you said there was quite a number of NGOs, American NGOs, British NGOs at the time. So yeah, in your book you say there was because a lot of people go, well, that's kind of suspicious. You're in Afghanistan in the weeks and months preceding 9/11, but you make the point very clearly that in Afghanistan that time there were a lot of Western expatriate NGOs working in Kabul.
Well, of course, people don't get labeled with being a terrorist supporter living under the Taliban simply because if they're not Muslims. It only happens, sadly, because if you're a Muslim or if you've been targeted by the intelligence agencies, as I had been before I'd left. The truth of the matter is there were numerous Americans, Australians, French, and others living as parts of the NGOs working in Afghanistan, and nobody ever suspected them or suggested that they were involved in terrorism in any way.
Okay, but you, what was your purpose for moving? So you're doing the NGO work, but you praised the Taliban for bringing social values to Afghanistan in your early days.
Well, I qualified it by saying that if you compare what happened in Afghanistan from the years after and during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and when the warlords would come in, and the warlords were fighting each other, they destroyed more of Kabul than the Soviets ever did. And then so when the Taliban came in, there was a sense of security, and there was a sense of security for people, at least in the early years. It was only after they implemented their harsh versions and harsh interpretation of Islam that there was a response. But in the early days, people were sick of the warlords, and that's why I qualified it by that statement.
Okay. And now that the US is fully leaving Afghanistan, do you believe the warlords will be back in control if they're not already?
Well, one thing I do know for a fact is that the United States, they actually co-opted some of those very warlords when they fought against the Taliban. Like, for example, Abdul Rashid Dostum, who was the head of the Uzbeks in Afghanistan, was known as one of the butchers of Afghanistan. And there were many others. And of course, the United States recognized that they were working with and in cahoots with some of these terrible violators of human rights. But to get rid of the Taliban, that's precisely what they did.
Right. Okay. Now the bombs start dropping. The U.S. campaign in Afghanistan started. It was October in 2001, and you fled from Afghanistan. Is that when you moved into Pakistan?
That's right. We evacuated, of course. We'd seen the bombs. I'd seen the effects of the bombs and the cruise missiles that came before that, and the carpet bombs, which were the 15,000-pound daisy cutters, euphemistically named. So the earth would shake underneath our feet. The windows of all our houses would get smashed on the road from the aftershocks of the bombing. So we evacuated under that, and I went eventually to Pakistan, where I have relatives. It's where my parents come from. I'd lived there before in the past, and I continued remaining there, helping some of the refugees up until the night of the 31st of January, when in my house that I'd taken up for a lease, there was a knock on my door, and several people stormed in, all unidentified, all ununiformed. One of them put a gun to my head, and then I was thrown onto the ground. My hands were shackled behind my back to my legs, and then hood placed over my head, and I was carried into the back of a vehicle in front of my children, in front of my wife, never to see them again for the next 3 years.
And what, was this the Pakistani intelligence service?
Well, it was the Pakistani intelligence service, but I learned soon enough inside the vehicle that it was administrated and orchestrated by the CIA. There were two agents there who were dressed, I'd say, very badly as Pakistanis. I could see very clearly that they were Caucasian in looks, and when they spoke with an American accent, and they told me that they would be sending me to Kandahar and then to Guantanamo Bay.
Now, I mean, the Pakistani intelligence service, I mean, these guys have a ruthless reputation for cruelty. And what I found was interesting, I think you said it might have been a BBC interview, that when you were handed over to the Americans, you think, oh, thank God, this is going to be some relief. But in fact, you said the Americans treated you far crueler than what the Pakistanis did.
Yes, I mean, look, it's important to note that Pakistanis were very brutal with many of the suspects. They weren't with me. I think the Pakistanis were apologetic to me. They felt, when they came into my house, they felt that that I certainly was not wanted and I'd not done anything wrong. But I did see the Pakistanis beat and torture others, and it was horrific. So when they handed me over to the Americans, I thought, finally, here's something that I can relate to. I'm born and raised in the UK. I've been brought up on a diet of American films and culture and so forth. So I felt that perhaps these might be the good guys, and I was so wrong, because they made the Pakistanis look tame compared to what I was to endure next.
So what was the immediate charge against you? What was the charge made? Did the Pakistanis tell you, or the Americans?
There's no such thing as charges. These terms that you're using now are in a normal place. Things like charges and courts and arrest and due process simply didn't exist. It was, you are now in the custody of the United States of America, and you have no rights. That was the terminology that was given and said to us. And of course, what followed showed that this had nothing to do with any legal process at all. Not any uniform code of military justice, not only civil law, no law at all. And that is why to this day Guantanamo sits outside of the rule of law with its own unique system to this day, 13 years later.
Okay, so you were transferred there from Pakistan to Bagram. How long were you in Bagram for?
So what happened is that I was initially held and taken on this military transport plane, hooded and shackled and stripped naked, with my hands and my legs tied to the floor of the C-130 transport plane. And I think you wouldn't hold cattle like this or sheep. And then I was taken to Kandahar. In Kandahar, we were punched and kicked and stripped naked. My clothes were torn off with a knife. I could feel the cold blade of the steel as it glided against my skin. We were being spat at. The dogs were brought to salivate over us. They took photographs and trophy pictures of us and paraded us naked in front of each other, shaved our faces, shaved our hair. We wouldn't be able to recognize ourselves when we saw us, looked in the mirror. And it was in this place in Kandahar where we were given those There were first blue jumpsuits and later became the orange, the signature orange jumpsuits. And I was held there in a converted barn that had been divided by concertina razor wire to form cells between us, between the prisoners. I remained there for about 6 weeks, being interrogated by a multitude of alphabet agencies, and then moved on to Bagram, where I ended up remaining for a year.
You said Bagram was the worst part of your imprisonment. At one stage, you were led to believe by the U.S. military personnel there that your wife was being tortured in the cell next door to you. I mean, that must have been an unimaginably horrific experience.
Well, I didn't know what became of my wife and children. I just knew that I'd left them in that house that day, and I knew that they knew it was one of my my weak points. So they would interrogate me often, threaten to send me. They would threaten to send me to Egypt or to Syria, which was very crucial and a very frightening prospect. But also, I remember in May of 2002, it was the CIA and the FBI together in interrogations who threatened me with pictures of my children, which they'd seized from my house and waved them in front of me while my hands were tied behind my back to my legs, like I was hog-tied. And they'd say, "What do you think happened to your children and your wife? Where do you think they are now?" And while they're asking me these questions, there's a woman screaming in the room next door. Now, I've never heard my wife scream, so I don't know what she would sound like if she did. But I knew that was my fear, and that's what they suggested, what was happening next door. And the punching and the kicking was bearable, but this suggestion that my wife was next door was unbearable. And I was simultaneously feeling hate and despair and didn't know what to do.
And I guess this is where the forced confession, I guess, I'm just for the benefit of my listeners, this is the confession that the Pentagon said that you made, and I quote, "I was armed and prepared to fight alongside the Taliban and Al-Qaeda against the US and others, and eventually retreated to Tora Bora to flee from US forces when our front lines collapsed. I knowingly provided comfort and assistance to Al-Qaeda members by housing their families, helped distribute Al-Qaeda propaganda, and received members from terrorist camps, knowing that certain trainees could become Al-Qaeda operatives and commit acts of terrorism against the United States." Now, that was a confession you were forced to sign in Bagram?
This is a confession that I signed in Guantanamo, but I signed it after I was sent from Bagram. I was sedated, put under heavy drugs, because the journey from Bagram to Guantanamo took about 36 hours with a stop in Turkey. And that journey meant being shackled to the plane, to the floor with a hood placed over your head, and blacked out goggles over the eyes, ear covers, industrial ear covers, and a face mask. And so you're not able to even scratch your nose. So they gave me a sedative and they knocked me out literally. I woke up in Guantanamo in a daze. It was in this daze that these same interrogators who had been in Bagram turned up with a confession that they had prepared in their language, in their writing. And they said, "If you don't sign this confession, then you will go to a summary court where you may be executed." And it was in light of that they produced their handwritten, their prepared testimony, which I signed. And I signed it because I thought if I do, they said that I'll get to go to court. And in court, I thought I might be able to expose the torture, the lies, and the terrible abuse that was taking place.
And I remember you right there that, you demanded to see a lawyer, but they said, no, you're not going to see a lawyer until you sign this first.
Absolutely. It was a black hole. It was a complete black hole of detention. There was no sense. I've studied law. I studied law for 2 years in the UK. I understand the concepts of habeas corpus, the right to the body, that you are either charged or released. I understand that America adheres to that. But in this black hole where we were called enemy combatants, we were told, you are now the property of the United States of America and you have no rights. When they said these words, they meant them. And, of course, in Bagram, while I was there, I saw the worst part of it. The worst wasn't seeing torture. The worst was seeing death. And when I saw 2 people being beaten to death by U.S. soldiers, one of them was a taxi driver called Delaware. His story is featured in the Oscar-winning story Taxi to the Dark Side, in which his hands were tied to the top of the cage and he was repeatedly punched and kicked on his leg up until I think he'd been struck over 100 times and his artery had collapsed and he died as a result of the blood not circulating in his body.
And
So these are the types.
this happened in front of you.
This happened in front of me. This happened. His beating. His death didn't happen in front of me, but his beating began in front of me, and they took him away to another isolation cell where that night he died in 2003.
So did you have any? There's no contact with other prisoners. Is that how I understand it? You were in solitary confinement for 18 months.
Yeah, it varied, of course, from time to time, to place to place. In Baghran, I was in with other prisoners. We weren't allowed to talk, but we could still manage whispered conversations. We were constantly being watched by guards with shotguns and so forth. In Guantanamo, for about 18 to 19 months, I was in solitary confinement and had no access, no communication with any other prisoners other than guards, who I have to say, some of whom were very decent, and we later built strong relationships that exist to this day. And eventually, my last few months in Guantanamo were in the company of numerous prisoners, about 6 prisoners, 2 of whom were supposed to be close associates of Osama bin Laden. One of them was his driver, the other one was his cook, and another was supposed to be his personal videographer. But other than that, there was very little contact with other prisoners.
You say what I found interesting, and this is why I write a lot about Islamophobia, because it's the dehumanizing, and the demonizing, especially the dehumanization process. That's when it becomes, words become dangerous. And it was interesting where I read that you said over a period of time, initially some American soldiers or guards treated you fairly, but over time they became desensitized to the torture and the inhumane treatment. And so speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of that. There was one particular American soldier who I found intriguing. He was white, Irish American, who'd been born up on a Native American reservation. So he felt, and I remember him saying that the way we treated Native Americans is the way we're treating you, i.e. that you are the other, you're the brown-skinned, darker-skinned people who speak different languages, have a different culture, and we can see the dehumanization. He didn't like it in the beginning, but as time went on, he's one of the soldiers who I saw beat a prisoner who tried to escape, to the point that prisoner was killed. And I had seen him very clearly that there was one of the soldiers who I got along with quite well in the early days in Kandahar, and he told me how he'd grown up on a Native American reservation. He himself was white Irish American, and he'd seen that he compared the parallels of the dehumanization process, where he said that how people regarded the Native Americans were how they were regarding us as the darker skinned brown people with the other religion, with the different looks and the different culture. And slowly but surely he began to change and become desensitized, and began the process itself of being involved in the dehumanization of the prisoners. He was one of the soldiers who beat an escapee to death in front of me, and it was part of his change, part of him seeing us as less than human because of what he was experiencing, because of the mundane, the banality of dehumanizing people. And it was the banality of torture in itself that was taking over. It was rampant, it was rife. Everybody was doing it, and it was only the few amongst the soldiers who recognized that they had been scarred forever.
Yeah, and you also said there was a guard that said to you at Gitmo, he said, "Hell, if I wasn't a terrorist before I came to Gitmo, I'd sure as heck be one after I left." I mean,
yeah, this was a soldier who, again, I became quite close to. He was of Haitian origin, and we used to speak quite regularly. He even wrote a poem that I still have to this day, in which he expressed his disgust at what was taking place. But he said very clearly that, Moazzam, if I wasn't a terrorist when I came here, the way you guys are being treated, I would be by the time I leave. And essentially, I think that's being used as one of the numerous arguments by the US government to not release people, because to say by the way they've been treated, if they weren't terrorists, they would be by the time they're released, so we should keep them in custody.
Yeah, and they just speak so much to the radicalization process of a terrorist, and this is what frustrates me. I wrote a piece last week for Middle East Eye on the radicalization process, and in the aftermath, for example, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the media wants to focus almost exclusively on the religious aspect of the terrorists and totally gloss over or not even mention the political grievance which is at the core of the radicalization. I mean, if you look at any terrorist from al-Awlaki to the Sydney gunmen to the Paris attackers, the radicalization process comes less from, reading the Quran. It comes from, either watching YouTube videos of US and Israeli atrocities or experiencing firsthand being the victim of this war on terror. But when we don't speak to these issues, we're never going to solve the terrorist problem because we're doing nothing. Yep.
Hello? Yeah, I can't help but wondering if it's somebody else trying to interfere in all of this.
Yeah, I know. You got me paranoid now. So there's a tendency in the media, particularly the Western media, to focus almost exclusively on the religious aspect of the terrorists, because that's a way of not shining a light on our role in this never-ending cycle of violence. Non-state violence is always a reaction to state violence, but we refuse to look at our role. So by externalizing evil, by focusing on the Islamic aspect and not focusing on the political grievances, because every terrorist case, certainly in the last major terrorist attacks, the political grievances is where the radicalization process takes place. And your experience speaks to that, where, even the Gitmo guard said that to you. Heck, I would have been radicalized to become a terrorist if I had experienced this. So I kind of want you to speak to that a little bit.
Well, there is a very, very important causal link between everything, the things that I've witnessed up until and what led to where we are today. We have, I think, the greatest threat we're told to Western civilization apparently is from Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Now, I just want to go back a little bit. When I was in the Bagram detention facility, and as I told you, I was interrogated by the CIA and the FBI, they brought me into one interrogation and they said that if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to send you to either Syria or to Egypt. And they told me that they had sent a man to Egypt already, and this man's name was Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. This man's name is extremely important because he was at that time supposed to be the most senior ranking member of Al-Qaeda captured to date. And what they said they did with him is that they'd sent him to Egypt. I learned later that he'd actually been sent in a coffin while he's still alive. And in Egypt, he was tortured by the Mubarak regime in cahoots with the United States into giving a false confession that Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein were working together on a chemical weapons program. And of course, this statement was taken by Colin Powell, that was handed to him by the CIA, and given to the United Nations Security Council in 2003 to argue for a case of war in Iraq. Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi then, from Egypt, was moved to several secret locations, which culminated in him being sent to Libya, where he turned up dead in his cell in 2009, when nothing was ever recorded about his, and further was recorded about what happened. Now here's the crucial part of the causal link, because Al-Qaeda didn't exist in Iraq before the invasion. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who used to live in Afghanistan up in the northwest, moved his operation and took it into Iraq. In Iraq, he set up an organization, and that organization then afterwards joined and became part of Al-Qaeda. That later became Islamic State in Iraq. Then that Islamic State in Iraq pushed when the Syrian revolution began and became Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. And then that became Islamic State today. So you can see this causal link. But the one more thing you can add to this is that you can see that the prisoners that the Islamic State has been capturing and dressing has been in orange suits. I had assumed they were doing this in solidarity with the Guantanamo prisoners, but I was wrong. They were doing this to a reminder that they themselves in Iraq were held in places like Camp Booker and Abu Ghraib. 17 members of ISIS leadership were held by the Americans and tortured in these dungeons. So it's unsurprising now that when they themselves were put in orange suits by the Americans, they then reciprocate by capturing Americans and Britons and executing them after dressing them in orange suits. That's the cause.
Yeah, I mean, even al-Baghdadi. I mean, al-Baghdadi was tortured at Camp Booker himself. I mean, you said it. 17 of the ISIS leadership were tortured under U.S. control.
Yeah, and so this is my point about the radicalization process doesn't happen in and of itself. But when we're talking about the cartoons, protests, and so forth, we saw the abuse of our religious values and views and who we were, and the racial hatred that began while we were being beaten and tortured. One of the guys, the person I mentioned, the taxi driver, that he was being kicked to death by American soldiers, and the autopsy report said that he was shouting Allah, Allah every time they kicked him, and they found that so amusing that they kept on kicking him again and again. So it was part of this religious abuse. It was when they would tear the Quran up in front of us and throw it into the toilet, that would be designed to stir us up, to make us feel even more violated. So it was not in and of itself. If it was just the religious abuse by itself, without the physical violence, you could have said that's one thing. But when you couple it up together, then it's something else. And that's how the world is seeing it. We're not just seeing it in and of itself in a vacuum.
And that's what the media does. The media, particularly Western media, likes to pretend these terrorists are created in a vacuum. All of a sudden, these lifelong Muslims, all of a sudden, they get this sudden spiritual awakening to want to commit terrorist atrocities. I mean, it's so far-fetched. It's ridiculous. But I mean, this. And what shocks me is when the CIA torture report came out. Not only were Americans. I feel like the American reaction to it was tepid at best, but in the days leading up to the report being released, particularly all the conservatives on the right, this is going to inspire terrorist attacks around the world. This is going to be a threat to national security. But the response in the Muslim world wasn't that fierce or feisty. Do you believe that's because, they knew what was already in it because they'd lived it, and people in the Muslim world are very, very conscious of and very knowing of what happened inside those prisons?
Well, of course. I mean, the Arab Spring happened partly as a result of the torture that was outsourced by the Americans to these countries. People had had enough of these dictators who had been, in some cases, complete allies. In other cases, like Gaddafi, brought in from out of the cold. So people knew already what was going on. In fact, they would say that despite how bad Guantanamo is, they're not as bad as the torture camps that are in Libya, Syria, Egypt, and elsewhere. But the sinister part of this, of course, that wasn't really discussed, is the role of these governments and the role of the CIA and the British MI5 and others in working with these regimes, where they were handing people over to the Assad regime, where they were handing them over to Mubarak in Egypt and to Gaddafi in Libya. That never came out, and that part of it still has to be explained properly, because they were clearly working with some of the worst despots we've ever seen in recent times.
And to this day, what are things like for you at the moment? I mean, the Pentagon, still maintains that you're involved in terrorist activities. You were recently, arrested and interrogated in Britain. Was that last year?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So you still, I mean, put it in crude terms. British security is on your case, is on your shit non-stop at the moment.
I think they just don't know what they're doing at all. I mean, they arrested me. They arrested me knowing that I was going to Syria, and they were, in fact, in one case, prepared to facilitate my travel to Syria, knowing that I might possibly go there and be involved in fighting, though that's not what I was doing. I was investigating links, as I said, into British and American complicity in handing over suspects to the Assad regime. Nonetheless, I was arrested. They raided my house. They turned it upside down. They threw out my family. They put me into Britain's own Guantanamo, as it's called, Belmarsh prison. I was held as a Category A prisoner for 7 months. But I was raring for the fight. I've been prepared. I've been arrested numerous times now by various authorities around the world. I've never been taken to court. That's also true of this case. I wasn't taken to court. My case fell apart before I went to court. If it had gone to court, again, I believe 100% I would have won, and I would have also shown that the British policy in Syria is extremely confused and duplicit, and that the whole concept of what terrorism is had to be debated, and British policy in relation to Syria would have been destroyed, because a precedent would have been set in that everybody that helps the Syrian resistance isn't a terrorist. And so at the end of that process, I was released. I was found not guilty before the charges even came to court, and the police declared me, and I quote, Moazzam Begg is an innocent man. Nonetheless, they put me under all sorts of terrorism asset freezes, took my passport away, and I'm still trying to pick up the pieces of my life. But I'm once again suing them, and once again I am confident 100% that I will win and that they will lose.
And you founded now a non-profit advocacy group, Caged Prisoners. Talk about that and the group's mission.
Yeah, it's called Cage now, CAGE, and I didn't found it because I was, as they say, a little tied up at the time. I was in Guantanamo, so it was already operating and campaigning for me while I was in Guantanamo. It was set up by professionals and volunteers, and was the first listing of the most comprehensive listing of Guantanamo prisoners. Now its remit has extended to the war on terror, or the new war on terror rather, inside the UK and elsewhere and in Europe, where we try to simply call for the rule of law, accountability, and because of that we become targeted by various organizations and the government, who simply don't like us calling to and pointing out the fact that they have been caught red-handed again and again and again, working with despotic regimes in the name of national security. But some of the best work we've done actually has been with former Guantanamo soldiers and interrogators who have come across to the United Kingdom, who have met with us in our homes and with our families, who we've toured around the world with and spoken about the evils of Guantanamo, the torture process and dehumanization, and said that there's another way where we can extend our hands across the ocean to one another and welcome each other. I'm praying and waiting for the day when America's prepared for that, because we brought these people into our homes, and these soldiers, and they still are our friends, and they were the ones who were guarding us while our children were born and we were in custody. I don't think America still, after 13 years, has the appetite to allow us to come over there so that we can be welcomed in their homes.
Yeah, one thing Americans don't like doing is introspection and self-examination, to make a broad sweeping generalization. So I'm not sure how well it'll go. But I guess one final question there is, in the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo attack, give me a sense of how fearful British Muslims are in this rise of Islamophobia and right-wing violence, which is sweeping Europe and the UK at the moment.
Well, I remember when September 11th happened, and I'd been arrested, and the CIA and FBI were telling me that the world has changed. But when I came back, actually, it wasn't so bad. It's been incrementally getting worse and worse. You had the July the 7th bombings in the UK, and then you had the various invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan continue. And I thought it was actually getting better, but it wasn't. My arrest took place well before the whole Islamic State declares itself as such. And by the time Charlie Hebdo's happened, things are far worse than they were ever when the war on terror happened. So it's because of there's an economic frustration in Europe. There's an economic downturn. It's easy to blame the foreign minorities, and what easier than the Muslims, because so many British and European soldiers are being killed in the Muslim countries. So there's that sense of solidarity some people have. But there's also a great deal of ignorance and this attempt to try to force everyone, all the Muslim community, to condemn, to apologize for, to somehow say that we're responsible, 1.6 billion of us, for the actions of people that we don't agree with. Nonetheless, the fear factor then has caused people to become to prevent them from speaking about things that they know are correct. They are stopping themselves from saying things to protect themselves. They are becoming more they're becoming more
self-censorship.
Cloistered as communities, and absolutely self-censorship is something that's happening a lot. And so instead of people reaching out as they should be, they're finding security within their own communities, and that's driving people apart.
Mm. I believe it's we're heading into scary times in Europe and UK. I mean, particularly Western Europe, these economies are spiraling now. They're moving into recession. As you said, whenever economic times turn bad, it's always the last off the boat to get the blame, or a convenient minority. And you look at the rise of these right wing parties, whether it's in Germany and France now. It's Chris Hedges writes about this a lot too. The myth of human progress. We think we're progressing as a species, but it's never in a linear line. We always come back and repeat the sins of the past. And I feel that the immigrant backlash in these countries is only going to get sharply worse and quicker. So, mate, Moazzam, where's the best place to get your book? I mean, as I said, it's a fantastic book, and I encourage everyone to read it.
I believe that it may have been out of print now. I think there are still some copies available on Amazon.com, but that's about the only place I think that they're out of print and sold out, I'm afraid.
Okay, and you have a website for the Caged Prisoners?
Yeah, it's www.cageuk.org, and all the latest information about our campaigns and work is available on there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Moazzam, again, thank you very much for your time, mate. You've experienced firsthand, a remarkable chapter in Western civilizations. I mean, you're there, and I mean, you've shone a light on it. I don't think we're never going to be able to right the wrongs unless we really address the wrongs that have happened in our name. And mate, I thank you for doing that.
It's my pleasure, and absolutely wishing you the best and all your listeners. And I hope that we can prevent what some people think is the inevitable, and that is a clash. I hope we can prevent it.
Absolutely. All right, Moazzam, great talking to you, mate.
Bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.